Hello viewers, welcome to K Diagnostics. Dio here. Today we have a 2013 VW Jetta. This vehicle came here to us because there is a noise that's being heard every time the clutch pedal is pressed to the floor. This vehicle has a manual transmission, and the customer said that every time he presses the clutch pedal to the floor, there is a noise coming from under the hood. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to confirm the customer's complaint. Hopefully the noise is going to be loud enough so you can hear it. I hope the camera is going to pick it up. And after we confirm the customer's complaint, then we will talk about what directions we're going to go so we can fix whatever that's causing the noise under the hood every time the clutch pedal is pressed. From experience, I can already tell what's causing the noise, but let's confirm the customer's complaint first, and then I will tell you what's causing the noise. Then we will do this repair together. So now let's go inside the vehicle and confirm the customer's complaint. Alright, so we're gonna confirm the customer's complaint. The vehicle is in neutral, so I'm going to step on the clutch pedal. So I'm gonna step on the clutch pedal and I'm gonna start the car. So the car is running. We are in neutral right now, and my left foot is still on the clutch pedal, so I'm gonna let off. I hope you can hear that grinding noise under the hood. So I hope you heard that. So when I let off, there's a grinding noise coming from under the hood. So now I'm gonna step. I hope you can hear that. Okay, so there is definitely a noise. I hope the camera is picking that up, guys. It's a grinding noise. I can hear it. It's pretty loud. Yeah, so the customer is complaining about that noise, okay? And this noise is caused by a throwout bearing. When you have a defective throwout bearing, as you press the clutch pedal, the throwout bearing goes out and it presses the pressure plate on the clutch to release the disc between the flywheel and the pressure plate to allow the driver to shift gears, okay? And that's how a clutch works. So it basically disengages the engine from the transmission to allow the driver to upshift or downshift, okay? And this noise is definitely coming from the throwout bearing. So I'm gonna turn off the engine. All right, so the engine is off. We have confirmed the customer's complaint. To fix this, we're gonna have to replace the throwout bearing, the pressure plate, the clutch disc, and the flywheel, because these VWs have dual mass flywheels, and it's always recommended to replace flywheels when you do a clutch on this one. So I'm not just gonna replace the throwout bearing, I'm gonna replace the clutch assembly, the flywheel, and the throwout bearing. And maybe the slave cylinder too. I think the slave cylinder on this model is part of the throwout bearing. So that's what we're gonna have to do to fix this, okay? So this video is gonna be about how to remove and replace a clutch assembly, basically, on this vehicle. So now let's go under the hood. I'm gonna show you the things we're gonna start removing so that we can replace this clutch assembly. We're gonna have to drop the transmission to get this job done, because the clutch assembly is between the engine and the transmission. So the transmission has to come out so we can get access to the throwout bearing, the pressure plate, and the clutch disc, and the flywheel. So now let's go under the hood and do that. Alright guys, so to do this job, we're gonna have to drop the transmission. So the transmission is right over here on the driver's side. We're gonna have to remove the battery and the battery box. We're gonna have to remove the air filter box, pretty much all the components on this side, have to be removed, okay, besides the fuse box. So everything up here is going to be removed, and then we're going to remove the drive axles. Both drive axles have to come out, and then we're going to use an engine support bar to hold the engine up, okay, to support the engine so that the engine doesn't fall when we remove the transmission. And then everything, pretty much everything around the transmission is going to come out. We're going to remove the shifter cables, we're going to remove the starter, we're going to remove the turbo tube, the outlet tube that goes to the turbo. And once we get everything, we're going to unbolt the bolts that hold the transmission to the engine block, so the bell housing bolts. And after we remove all of that, the transmission will come out. So I'm going to remove the battery and the air filter box now. The air filter box just pops out, so I'm gonna undo this clamp over here, and then we're gonna pop the air filter box out, and then we're gonna remove the battery. So now let's do that. All right, so we're gonna remove the battery first. So now I can remove the battery. So now we're gonna remove the air filter box. I'm gonna disconnect this mass airflow sensor. So the battery, the air filter box will just pop out. We're gonna remove this inlet tube over here. Alright, so now I'm going to pry out the air filter box. So here comes the air filter box. I'm gonna get it out of the way. Alright, so we got the battery out and the air filter box out. So now I'm gonna bring you guys over here so you can see what I'm gonna remove next. Alright guys, so now the next step is going to be removing this battery tray. As you can see, this battery tray is really dirty. There are a lot of leaves here. So we're gonna remove the battery tray, and the battery tray has 3 bolts, 3 10mm bolts. So there's this one here, this one, and there's another one at this corner. So we're gonna remove all these bolts so we can remove the battery tray. So now let's do that. Alright, so right now the battery tray should be able to come out. Alright, so here comes the battery tray. So we're gonna get it out of the way. Alright guys, so we got the battery tray removed. So now the next step will be removing this tube. So this is the turbo inlet tube. We're gonna remove this upper radiator hose, and we're gonna remove these shifter cables. We're just gonna remove both cables and sit them up here, and then we're gonna remove the starter, and then the slave cylinder line. But before we do that, let's go under the vehicle and remove the drive axles, because we have to drain the radiator before we remove this upper radiator hose. So we gotta drain the radiator, drain coolant out of the radiator, and then we will undo the upper radiator hose. So for that, I'm going to lift up the vehicle. We're gonna drain the radiator. While the radiator is draining, we're gonna remove the drive axles, and then we'll come back up here so we can remove the rest of the stuff. So now let's go under the vehicle. Alright guys, so I checked the radiator underneath. The radiator on this vehicle doesn't have a drain plug, so we're just gonna have to remove that upper radiator hose and let coolant come out. I wanted to drain it, but there's no drain plug there. So we're gonna remove this plastic cover so we can get access to the drive axle here, and also the pretty much all the components on the transmission. So we're gonna remove the starter and everything else on this side. So I'm gonna remove these screws first. Alright, so we got this cover removed. Now we can have access to the starter, and the drive axle is right there. So now the next step is going to be removing the drive axle. So I'm gonna show you the process of removing the drive axle on the driver's side. We're gonna have to remove both axles, so I'm not gonna show you the passenger side, but it's the same process, okay? So the first thing we're gonna do is we're gonna remove the axle bolt, this bolt over here in the center, and then we're gonna remove these bolts over here on the joint, okay? All these bolts. So these bolts bolt the axle to the transmission. We're gonna remove all these bolts. And if you look down over here, I did put a mark. I hope you can see this white mark. So I'm gonna, when I put everything back together, I'm gonna line up these marks so that the axle can go at the same exact position as it's gonna come out, okay? And then I like to disconnect the knuckle from the lower ball joint. I'm gonna undo these bolts over here, these 3 16mm nuts. We're gonna undo these, and then we're gonna disconnect the hub, the whole complete steering knuckle, from this lower control arm. And then the next step will be undoing the outer tie rod. So this tie rod over here, we're gonna undo that. And after we undo the tie rod and the lower ball joint, we should be able to remove the drive axle, okay? And it's basically the same process on both sides to remove the drive axles. I'm going to sit you guys over here so we can remove this drive axle. Alright, so here comes the axle bolt. So we're gonna put it right there. Alright, so we got all the bolts that hold the axle on the transmission removed. So now we're gonna undo the bolts for the lower ball joint. Alright, so now we should be able to remove the axle. I'm going to Alright, so here comes the axle. So the axle is removed, so right here. We're gonna do the same process on the passenger side. So I'm gonna remove the axle and get it out of the way. So I'm not gonna film the process of removing the drive axle on the passenger side. It's basically the same thing. Once you undo these nuts over here on the lower ball joint and you undo the outer tie rod and you remove these bolts over here that hold the joint of the drive axle on the transmission, and you remove the main bolt over here for the axle, you tap it out, the axle should come out. So I'm gonna do the same thing on the passenger side. I'm not gonna film it. Once I do that, I'll bring you guys back up. But before we go on the passenger side, I'm gonna bring you guys over here so we can remove the starter bolt, and we're also gonna disconnect the other electrical connectors over here in front of the transmission. So now let's do that. So now we are here. The next step is gonna be removing the starter. So this starter right here, we're gonna remove that. And now we're gonna disconnect this electrical connector over here. So that's disconnected. So I'm gonna undo this nut over here and then the bolt behind it. We're gonna disconnect this tube. After we disconnect all this stuff, then we're gonna lower the vehicle so we can remove everything else on top of the transmission. So now let's do that. Alright, so we got this tube disconnected. So while we are down here, I'm gonna show you the bell housing bolt that I'm gonna undo. So I'm going to bring you under the vehicle so I can show you all these bolts over here on the bell housing that I'm gonna remove. We're gonna remove this bolt over here. This bolt connects the transmission to the engine block. So I'm gonna undo this bolt and then this one. And then I'm gonna remove this support bar over here. I'm also gonna undo this bolt here. And then we have another bolt back here. I'm gonna undo this bolt and then I will undo those bolts over there for the drive axle joint. This is the drive axle that goes to the passenger side. Once I undo all these bolts, then I'll bring you guys back up so we can lower the vehicle and remove everything else on top of the transmission. So this bar over here has these two bolts. They are 16 mil bolt. These two, and then that bolt over there that we also have to remove. So I'm gonna remove those bolts now. Alright guys, so I'm gonna bring you down here again so I can show you the bolts that are removed, and then I will remove the drive axle on the passenger side, and after that we're gonna lower the vehicle so we can remove everything else on top of the transmission. So I'm gonna bring you over here so you can see all the bolts, all the bell housing bolts you have to remove. So basically I'm doing everything that has to be done under here so that when I lower the vehicle, I don't have to raise it up again. So I don't want to go up and down. So I want to finish everything at the bottom. That way when we lower it, we're going to remove everything on top of the transmission, and then we will be able to remove the transmission. So now I'm going to show you everything I removed. Alright, so we are down here. I removed the bolt that was here. So all these holes that you see, this is where the bolts that I had removed go. So this one, that one, I removed that bar that supports the engine. And then there's another one back here that I removed. Okay, I'm gonna remove the drive axle off camera. Okay, the drive axle on the passenger side, I'm gonna remove it off camera. It's the same process like we did on the driver's side. So once I get this drive axle removed, then I'll bring you guys back up so we can lower the vehicle. So I will do that and then I'll bring you guys back up. Alright guys, so I have removed the passenger side drive axle. As you can see, the drive axle is no longer there. The drive axle is right there on the floor. So we're good to go. I have removed everything that we had to remove under the vehicle. So now we're gonna lower the vehicle so we can remove the other components on top of the transmission. Once we remove all the other components that are on top of the transmission, then we should be able to lower the transmission. So now let's lower the vehicle. The first thing we're gonna do is we're gonna disconnect the upper radiator hose. Remember, like I said, there's no drain plug on this radiator. So once I disconnect this upper radiator hose, there will be coolant leaking out. So I have a drain container under the vehicle. So all that coolant that's gonna leak out will go in that container. Alright, so here comes the upper radiator hose. So as you can see, coolant is leaking out. So it's going into the drain container under the vehicle. Alright, so now the next step is going to be removing a starter. So I'm going to remove this ground wire here first. Alright, so I got the starter control wire disconnected. So now we're gonna disconnect the power supply wire for the starter. last one. So here comes the other starter bolt. So here comes the starter. So we got the starter removed. So now let's get it out of the way. All right, so what's next, guys? So the next step is going to be disconnecting this throwout bearing hydraulic line. So this line over here has to be disconnected. There is a little clip that I'm just gonna undo. So I'm gonna remove this clip and then I will just lay this line back here. Now, when you disconnect this line from this point, you have to bleed the clutch when you're done, okay? Because there will be hydraulic fluid that will come out. Just remember to bleed the system at the end. I just like to put this rod in there so we don't lose all our brake fluid. So we're just gonna tack this line over here just so it can stay out of the way. Okay, so that's there. So what's next, guys? So now the next step is gonna be removing this tube. This tube has to come out, this turbo inlet tube. We're gonna undo this bolt over here. I'm gonna undo this bolt, and then there is a clamp that we have to undo here, and then this tube will come out. So now let's do that. Alright, so here comes the turbo tube. Okay, so we're gonna get it out of the way. Alright, so look how much room we have gained. Now we can get access to these bolts over here. These two transmission bolts. I'm gonna get a bungee cord and hold these wires up this way. And then the other thing will be removing these bolts over here for the shifter cables. Actually, let's do that now. Let's remove these shifter cables. So the first shifter cable, we just push it forward like that. So that comes out, and then this one has a little clip that we have to remove. So right there. So what I like to do with the shifter cables is I'm gonna undo these 3 bolts over here for the shifter cable mount, and then I will get a bungee cord and just hold the shifter cables up. Alright, so now the shifter cable can come out. So we're gonna get a bungee cord and hold these cables up this way. Alright, so we are making progress. Now we're almost down to the last steps before we remove the transmission. So we have enough room over here. At this point, the next step is going to be removing these two transmission bolts and then the transmission mount. After removing the transmission mount, we should be able to rock the transmission back and forth. We're going to rock it back and then the transmission is going to come out. But if we do that, the transmission will come out and the engine also will fall, because the engine is supported by a engine mount on the passenger side over there. Let me show you. There's an engine mount over there around the area where the coolant reservoir is, and then the other mount that supports the engine on the back is basically the transmission itself and the transmission mount. If we remove the transmission, the engine will only be supported by one mount, which is over there. So the back of the engine won't be supported. What will happen? The engine is going to fall. So before we remove the transmission mount, we're going to have to put a engine support bar that's going to support the engine. So the engine support bar is going to go across the engine bay. Okay, it's going to go across the engine bay. We're going to use that to support the engine. Okay, and after we install the engine support bar, we're going to remove the transmission mount, and then the transmission will be able to come out. Okay, so right now I'm going to undo this transmission bolt. I'm also going to loosen this one, and then we will install the engine support bar. After installing the engine support bar, then we will remove the transmission mount. Alright, so I cracked this bolt just to make it easier to remove once the transmission mount is out. So now I'm going to grab the engine support bar so we can install it. Actually, before I install the engine support bar, let's remove the engine cover first. Alright, so our engine support bar is going to go right here. Alright, so I'm gonna bring you guys here under the hood so I can show you what I'm about to remove next. Alright guys, so I have installed the engine support bar across the engine bay. So now the next step is gonna be removing the transmission mount. So after I get the transmission mount removed, we're gonna remove that bolt over there. Once we get the bolt removed, we're gonna lift up the vehicle so we can put the transmission jack under the transmission. And after we put the transmission jack under the transmission, we're gonna lower it and the transmission will come out. So now let's remove this transmission mount. Alright guys, so instead of removing all these bolts while the vehicle is low, I'm gonna raise up the vehicle first and then I will use a ladder and climb up here so I can remove the bolts for the transmission mount. That way we're gonna have our transmission already, that way we're gonna have our transmission jack already positioned under the transmission. So now let's lift up the vehicle and then we'll come up here to remove these transmission mount bolts. Alright, so we got Chris here to give us a hand. Chris is setting up the transmission jack. So we're gonna pump up the transmission jack all the way under the transmission. So right there. Alright, so we got the transmission jack under the transmission. So now we're gonna go on top of the transmission so we can remove the transmission mount. Alright guys, so we are back up here. So now I'm gonna remove these bolts for the transmission mount. So I'm gonna do that and then I'll bring you guys back up. Alright guys, so as you can see, I have removed the transmission mount. I hope you can see that crack over there between the transmission and the engine block. So the transmission is almost ready to come out. So now let's go under the vehicle and remove the transmission. So looks like we got a lift. Yeah, right there. Looks like we'll go down. Go. Go. All right, that's good. Looks like we are resting. Ah, I see. Right there. All right, so lower. Okay, hold on. Go up a little. Yeah. Okay.
You ready?
Okay, hold on. Let's go down. All right, guys. So here comes the transmission. Good. Okie dokie. right. Do you want to lower it to the last section there?
Ta-da.
Okay. Ta-da! Awesome. So we're gonna push this transmission out, and then we're gonna remove the clutch, pressure plate, and the disc. So now let's do that. Alright guys, so here is our clutch assembly. This is the pressure plate. The disc is between the pressure plate and the flywheel. I don't know if you can tell, there is a lot of dust around here. So now, watch this. Do you see how this pressure plate is moving? This play over here is excessive. There should just be a little bit of play, not a lot of play like this. You see that? So this here is the problem. So I'm gonna undo these bolts over here. These 9mm bolts. There is 6 of them. I'm gonna remove all of them so we can remove the pressure plate. We're gonna remove the pressure plate and the disc. We're gonna inspect it, but we're gonna order, after I remove this, we're gonna order the pressure plate, the disc, and the flywheel. All of this, we're gonna replace it as an assembly. And we're also gonna replace the throwout bearing. So now let's remove the pressure plate. Look at this. This is too much. That's the problem right there. Alright, so now we're gonna remove the pressure plate. So here comes the pressure plate. Do you see how worn out this is? Okay, so let's get this pressure plate out of the way. Look at the disc. The disc also is a little bit worn out. But this over here is the problem. This flywheel, this dual mass flywheel, we have to replace that. So clutch removed. Alright, so I'm now gonna remove this flywheel right now. I'm gonna call the dealer and order the new parts, because I didn't order the parts because when I called the dealership, they told me that this particular model had 2 types of clutches. There was the Look clutch and there was another brand. So the only way they could know is by removing the old clutch first, look at it, and then they can order the right one. So now that I know it's the Look one, L-U-K, I can go ahead and order it. Hopefully it's not gonna take too long to get. I'm gonna order the flywheel, the clutch disc, and the pressure plate, and the throwout bearing. Once I get the new parts, then we will remove this old flywheel. We're gonna install it, and then we will install the other parts of the clutch assembly. I'm gonna show you the old throwout bearing right now, and then I'm gonna leave this video here. I'll bring you guys back up after I get all the new parts. So now let's look at the old throwout bearing. But this over here is definitely bad, okay? You hear that? So that play over there is excessive. So now let's look at the throwout bearing before we end this video here. Alright guys, so here is our transmission. This is the old throwout bearing. I don't know if you can hear, but there is a little bit of noise in this throwout bearing. Okay, and the slave cylinder is part of the throwout bearing. Okay, and to remove this throwout bearing, we're gonna have to undo these 3 bolts. There's one over here, there's this one and that one. So we can remove the throwout bearing assembly. So we're gonna replace this throwout bearing also. I'm gonna get a new one from the VW dealership. And we're also gonna replace this clutch disc and this pressure plate. Okay, so I'm gonna get these new parts from the dealer, and then once I get all the new parts, I will bring you guys back up so that we can install them. So I will leave this video here. I'll bring you guys back up once I get the new parts. So I'll get the parts and then I'll bring you guys back up.